everyone, to episode 9 of the Senteon and CIS webinar series, a deep dive into the CIS benchmarks. I'm your host, Zach Krumkowski from Senteon, joined by my co-host, Rich McGraw from the CIS themselves. And we're both joined today by Josh Copeland. Josh was a speaker just the other week, and we are very thankful for him to stepping up. We did have a scheduling conflict with the expected speaker, Wes Spencer, so thank you for being here, Josh. Huge champion to the community, huge champion to us at Senteon. Thank you for making the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime you need it.
Awesome. So I won't give you too long of an introduction since I did that the other week, but Josh comes with a wealth of experience, 25 plus years in the field, Tulane adjunct professor, speaker at Black Hat. I'm just learning about being a co-author, so we'll let you introduce some of that. But before we get more into Josh, Rich, did you have anything you want to share?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Zach. It's always my favorite time of the week, joining yourself, Zach, and our weekly expert. So, yeah, I wanted to thank everyone for joining and watching our replays. I recognize the mundane nature of CIS benchmark settings and honestly settings in general. It's pretty dry stuff. But if you've been watching this series, you know it's more than just the CIS benchmarks. Zach and I leverage our personal network of cybersecurity industry professionals joining weekly to give you real world examples that we all can learn from. So, keep in mind, this is kind of boring topics, but we try to make it as interesting as possible and add real world examples of, why this stuff is important in things like that. So it's not just about the benchmarks. Very thankful to have Josh join us again today. If you don't know, Josh is a battle-tested senior executive currently keeping your data secure at AT&T. So let's go. Thanks again, Josh.
Absolutely. And this week's topic, like Rich said, none of this is necessarily overly sexy. We hear it from speakers all the time. It's an unsexy space, but very important to the foundation of your cybersecurity posture. So before we do dive into the interactive logon policies from the CIS benchmarks, I'd love just to kind of hear from Josh. The cybersecurity field is ever changing. There's yearly events going on, new events coming up, like our webinar series. Josh, could you kind of talk about some of the shows and events you're looking forward to and how you've just kind of seen the field grow and evolve with actually hosting and education material?
Yeah. One of the great things about cybersecurity is there's kind of a niche for everyone. If you're into like the super huge events, you have RSA conference in San Francisco, you have Black Hat coming up next week in Vegas. But if you're into kind of the more technical, get into break things, Black Hat's followed immediately by DEF CON, and that's really getting in, breaking things, picking locks, doing cool stuff. And it's very much a different vibe than Black Hat. When you go there, you can definitely tell they're two different communities focused on two very different things. You can have, very local stuff, like a ISC squared or an as is or an AFCEA chapter that's local to your area where you can go meet people that are local. You can have those kind of regional conferences. The state of Texas has a bunch that are in Houston and Austin and Dallas that really kind of bring people across from a region. My own area, Louisiana, we have NOLACon every year. It happens to coincide with the week that Tulane graduates every year, so it's always a good event for us. And it kind of gives you all these different flavors. And then even from that, there are massive amounts of webcons, events like this that give all kinds of opportunities. And you can hear about any topic you want. I'm speaking at Black Hat. I'm doing a presentation on AI, friend or foe.
Ooh.
So that'll be a interesting talk. You mentioned the book. I am co-author for Rock the Sock, a career guide for your first analyst role and beyond. And we have some really cool contributors to that. John Hammond from Huntress, who is a massive, personality in our space. Bill Britton from Cal Poly. He's talking about cybersecurity and academia. Dave Meese is talking about how to break into cybersecurity, leveraging LinkedIn. Lots of cool people that are all from different parts of the space come together to build kind of this real in your handbook that you will be able to get if you stop at Black Hat, and we'll give it out to you for free.
That is awesome. And I didn't know John Hammond was on it. Huntress is a massive player in our space. A lot of our partners who use Senteon also use Huntress. So very, very relevant to the MSP community. Could you share a little bit more about what that book topics on?
It's got about a dozen chapters. You know, so you want to be a SOC analyst by John Hammond. You know, he talks kind of the high level of why would you want to be a SOC analyst? You know, my chapter is on the hard and soft skills need to be a SOC analyst, you know, from all levels, from entry level, mid to senior, and how those changes and things that you can do to prepare yourself. I have a whole build out of how to do a lab in your home to kind of give those skills. Um, Dave Meese has a really good chapter on how to build your presence on LinkedIn to, you know, market yourself and become a better player in that space. You know, we have some folks from CyberSyn, like Deidre Diamond, who kind of has a chapter on navigating your cybersecurity career. You got some folks who are like deep into the research piece, like Chaz Lever, who is kind of digging into how to become a cyber researcher. You know, being a SOC analyst is one thing, but being a researcher is a totally other sphere. The amazing Kayla Williams has a chapter on how to position yourself from a SOC leadership role and then beyond and going up to like a CISO level role. So lots of really great content from really amazing people.
Really wide spectrum, it sounds like.
Yeah, I love that, Josh, because all of those people, I know a large majority of them personally, and you're not talking about an academic exercise that you talk about in school. These are experts that have been there, done that, and they're sharing that wisdom that, is really probably, I would imagine, a shortcut for anyone interested in those types of careers.
Yeah.
Leverage the smart people.
Yeah, it's amazing that we were able to get, you know, this many people from kind of those diverse backgrounds and the level of thought leaders in this
I
book.
personally listen to John Hammond weekly.
Yeah. I'm still trying to figure out how I got in on the book, but you know, everybody else is absolutely loving it.
No, they're lucky to have you, and so are we.
Anyone wants the unpopular opinion guy on their team. So that's absolutely awesome. And I've been noticing with our viewers and the people who reach out to me, a lot of them are new to the cybersecurity space or are still learning about it. So when you talk about, this book being one thing, having a wide spectrum, building your presence, but talking about those regional shows, would you consider it a good idea for people looking to break into the space really to attend these show? I mean, how important is it to be part of the community?
So being part of the community is, you know, one of those critical things. You know, when you look at the numbers, 70% of all jobs are not advertised anywhere. You have to know somebody to even get your resume in front of the right person.
Is that true? I haven't
Yeah.
heard that.
I'll send you the reference afterwards and you can post it up.
You run
But
your own company,
absolutely,
Zach.
it's absolutely true. So knowing somebody is actually a huge part of actually landing your job and building out kind of that reputation. You know, these small regional shows are great because they're super affordable. They don't require travel. You know, Black Hat and RSA are great events, but to get a, you know, briefing pass for Black Hat, it's going to run you, depending on when you buy it, from 2.5 to 3 grand, plus your
Hmm.
airfare, plus the hotel, plus
Hmm.
your Ubers and all the other stuff. So you're looking probably at a solid 5 grand trip to go to Black Hat or RSA as the kind of the
Easily.
equivalent. But you can pop out to one of these small ones. It's going to cost you $100 for your ticket. You know, it's typically local. The most you might
Meet
do is
those
a
regional
night in a
leaders.
hotel. You know, much more affordable. And then you're also networking with people who are close to you. You know, it's
Hmm.
not, you know, like me when I go to Black Hat and I see the people who I see 3 times a year at conferences. These are folks that, you know, you might run into at the grocery store or actually
That
do
need
real
help.
work with.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And personally, in my career, if honestly, if I look back at the last jobs I had, arguably probably all of them, it was via a connection in the industry. And it does work that way. So it's important to build your network.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously that's part of the scope of the book. I meant to ask before my last question. You mentioned you're handing it out at Black Hat, visiting. Is there any other way to get this book, will it be available via Amazon, or is this going anywhere else?
There will be a digital experience on the book forthcoming that will launch after Black Hat.
Awesome. We'll be looking forward to that. We'll promote the link. Well, very, very cool. Thank you for that introduction. So let's start to dive a little bit more into today's topic. We do have about, I believe it's 8 settings today. So we'll spend a few minutes on each topic, and we should be able to finish probably a little bit before the hour even. We'll see how many stories Josh shares. But yeah, so let's kick off. So interactive logon policies. Could you just kind of talk about from a high level, what is an interactive logon policy? What's the business goal of implementing these, and what kind of drives the need?
Yeah. So really, when you think about interactive login, those two words have meaning. We all log into systems all day long. You can do it through a variety of means. You might have your home computer where you just boot it up and it goes straight in. That's still a login. Interactive login requires you to do something. It requires, you to put information, whether that be, password, a username, a token, multi-factor authentication, something that makes it to where you're interacting with that machine. And that's really critical when you look at it from a security perspective, because you want to ensure who's using your machine is who they say they are. It's the entire premise behind having, identification as part of your security posture. So I want to be able to say, Zach logged into this machine or Josh logged into this machine. I don't want it to be a scenario where this machine was logged into by somebody and I have no clue who's doing this.
And it's funny, every single week, especially when we did talk about domain member with you, all of this is, a lot of these CIS benchmarks we continuously talk about every single week is about preventing that unauthorized access. This is the security posture, your cyber hygiene. If we can mitigate the risk of just keeping the bad guys out, right? Mitigate the risk of letting them in, rather. That's a no-brainer. These CIS benchmarks are extremely powerful in that respect. Talking a little bit more on this interactive login, I couldn't help but think, and we'll probably get more into this once we get into the settings, but it sounds like it's going to make it a little bit painful for the user. Might take a little bit of extra time on their end to prove who they are and stuff. Like, is that a worry with these policies?
It can be. You obviously have the classic tug of war between usability and security. They are, absolutely opposing forces. That the more usable something is, typically the less secure. The more secure it is, the less usable it is. So finding that, happy balance between what your security risk posture looks like versus the usability that you require really becomes that kind of, do I need it for this? So do you have a system that is just a kiosk that just has internet access, that's on a separate VLAN, that doesn't interact with anything else, that you just have for customers to go print out airplane tickets or whatever? That doesn't need the same level of control as the system that I'm using to, check people into a hotel or enter bills and orders into my, corporate system, Salesforce or whatever. Very different perspectives on those. And that kind of drives, well, what do I really need? Do I need, to know who's logged in and have a lot of control around this? Probably not. But this, absolutely, I need to have a lot of controls around that, because now I'm dealing with money, I'm dealing with product, I'm dealing with customer reputation, I'm dealing with business reputation. So you kind of have to find what your balance is.
You need to understand those risks, right? You understand, the printer, if it's isolated, not so much. Salesforce, if that's, misconfigured or open to people that shouldn't be logging in, not so good.
And taking this a step further, sorry, I lost it. So let's take that a step further and relate some of these to how the bad actors may try to take advantage of these security policies. So going into the risks of having this poorly configured, it sounds like the key one is really that initial access. By having these interactive logon policies, you're mitigating that risk. And if we can pull up that slide. But could you talk to us a little bit about the MITRE attack tactics that would be mitigated by having a strong policy in place?
So a lot of it's just going to be the ability to pivot from that machine to another machine.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at it from perspective, if I'm able to access the machine, now I'm able to leverage everything on that machine to be able to go try to get other machines in that environment. So what is on the machine that I compromise by using a credential based attack, I might be using just a user based credential.
Mm-hmm.
No administrative privileges, nothing that's kind of crazy. But I can then use that box to kind of pivot, hop around. A scenario that occurred in one of the companies I was working with. This is back when Blackberries were still really big.
Sure.
They had a department that had to run as local admin because they had an application that was legacy application, which we all know is bad, but it required administrative privileges to be able to run it properly. They sent out a targeted spear phishing email that was able to go capture those credentials, then leverage those credentials to pivot to other boxes using those same credentials until they finally had a domain administrator compromise on one of those boxes because they logged in to do something, which then went over to a SQL server that was supporting the BlackBerry enterprise and gave a enterprise level account because they did an SQL injection into that because it wasn't properly patched. And then they had enterprise level access. So that entire organization was compromised because one person clicked on a spear phishing
Mm-hmm.
email and there was a series of controls that were not properly implemented in that layer of defense in depth model. And one of those things was, persistence of accounts. They allowed accounts to stay active even when there was no activity on the account. So those sessions were still allowed to be, alive, and that keep alive allowed them to pivot to other things.
And I'm
Josh,
curious.
let me ask this. What did the remediation of that situation look like?
That was not a pleasant experience because they had to go and change all of these domain and enterprise level service accounts and then have to go through and remediate both the BlackBerry server and the SQL server running behind it. And they went and took a hard look at that legacy application on does it really need those admin privileges? And they eventually did away with that legacy application because of the vulnerabilities it introduced by requiring to be running in full admin access, even though it was just local admin access versus a domain access.
Sounds like the kind of thing that proper controls and settings and understanding of risk may have avoided, perhaps.
Absolutely. You kind of one of those things where you can control what you know, and you have tools like CIS benchmarks that help you control things that maybe you don't fully understand because you have a lot of smart people that go in the room and go, this is the best practice. This is the way you set this up because this limits your risk in a way that is safe, it's effective, and provides you the best knowledge without you having to be the expert in that area. Um,
Yeah, if you want to protect yourself against those MITRE attack frameworks that we're talking about, the CIS benchmarks are tested against those MITRE attack framework common models before we publish them. So you are getting settings that have real world testing, not an academic exercise. And folks like Josh are contributors that have the experience and the knowledge to know what the appropriate settings are to protect you. So take advantage of that, and Senteon can make it easy, right, Josh?
Absolutely.
Appreciate the plug, guys. Dive into that to a little further. You're talking about how the attacker got the credentials and then effectively performed credential stuffing across the board to see where they could get in. If I was following that chain of attack correctly.
Yep.
So if you did have a strong hardened baseline, would that actually make that attack technique, take more effort? Like, I feel like without a hardened baseline, they can probably just automate that whole process. Click a button, it scripts out, it just attempts and stuffs all automatically. So if you do have a hardened baseline, does it actually make that harder?
Yeah, it makes it harder because the box that you're trying to access when you pivot isn't going to accept that kind of attack.
Mm,
It's going to You're going to automate that. It's going to hit the front door and go, nope, in
I
an
hear
event.
you, but no thank you.
Yeah. Like, I do not want whatever it is that you're trying to hand me the pamphlet for.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you did keep on mentioning certain applications required you to do this, so you weren't able to do it. How normal is it for an enterprise? I work with a lot of managed service providers to where their clients are 500 machines or less. And a lot of the time when they use our solution, they'll create a single baseline per customer, and they want to standardize that across all of their clients. At what point, or how common or uncommon is it to have different baselines within a single business? Have you experienced anything like that?
Yeah, it's actually, not only is it something that should be common, it should be even more common. You should have very tailored baselines based off of what those job functions are. Somebody who's working in your IT department is going to have inherently different requirements of their systems than someone who is working in the finance. I'm working in the IT department. I work routers and switches. I absolutely should have the ability to do SSH across my network. But the person in accounting absolutely should not. And I don't want to have the same policy covering both of those people because they have inherently different functions. Because it's all about reducing your attack surface. What can I do to shrink the amount of area that I have vulnerability so that I'm only letting the least amount of risk occur to my network, my enclave, and essentially my data.
Concept of least privilege, and even better than that, zero trust if you can get there.
Hell of a concept. We could have a whole episode on zero trust and how it can relate and what it really means. We'll hold that off for another episode. So, all right, let's dive a little bit more into these settings. So the CIS benchmarks, Rich, I'll go ahead and share my screen and show a little bit of what the resources CIS provides. But go ahead and give us a quick overview of what are the CIS benchmarks, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm probably hopefully preaching to the choir here, but in general, the Center for Internet Security is a nonprofit. Our mission is to identify, develop, validate, promote, sustain best practices for cyber defense. And to that end, we draw upon cybersecurity experts and professionals from government, business, academia around the world, people like Josh, and to develop those best practices, including the benchmarks and controls and hardened images. We follow a consensus decision-making model. And really what that results in terms of IP is the CIS benchmarks, and they are configured as baseline best practices for securely configuring a system. And that's what we're diving deep into now. All of the guidance recommendations reference one or more of the CIS controls. And the CIS controls were developed to help organizations improve their cyber defense capabilities. We recommend that everyone meet minimally the CIS controls implementation group 1 for basic cybersecurity hygiene. And what's nice about the controls too is if you are in a regulatory, type of industry, we have very easy mapping, and Senteon does it automatically for you too, to map into other regulatory frameworks, including NIST, ISO 2700, PCI, DSS, HIPAA, others. So each benchmark really undergoes 2 phases of consensus review. The first, during initial development, is when experts convene and discuss and create and test working drafts until they reach a consensus on the benchmark. During the second phase, after the benchmark is published, the consensus team reviews the feedback from the community, and an iterative process begins for continuous improvement. So that's what the benchmarks are all about. It's a very detailed set of security settings. That's what Josh and I are hoping to expose, and Zach are trying to expose on this series. And that's what it's all about. If that's not too
Yeah.
much.
No, that was a good overview. So we'll definitely get into it. And what I'm showing on my screen is exactly what CIS and Senteon provide through their platform. Is just kind of the description of each setting, the rationale and impact, and how it fits across multiple other frameworks. So you can kind of customize that here to make that work for whatever framework you're working on following. So CIS is very flexible. It's the foundation of many others. So let's dive into the settings with that intro. So thank you for that, Rich.
Yes, sir.
All right. First setting on the docket today, and it is my favorite, and I call it out during every single onboarding because Microsoft GPOs can be confusing. So do not require Control Alt Delete is set to disabled. So spoiler alert, do not and disabled do cancel each other out. So this will actually enable Control Alt Delete. Josh, could you actually talk to us about this? And if you want to mention anything about how Microsoft titles their GPOs, feel free.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, the way the GPOs are typically worded is that they are worded in a way that says, do the thing that is opposite of what the default configuration is. So the default configuration is to enable Control Alt Delete. So therefore, the GPO to enable that would be to do not require Control Alt Delete. So that's where you get this weird double negative language
That was a
where it's
great explanation. I didn't know you actually had a reason for it.
absolutely have a reason for it.
I can't toss any question at you you don't have an accurate answer for.
That's why we bring on the expert, Zach.
So, but why would you want Control Alt Delete? Why do you need kind of this kind of mechanism before you get to a login screen? It's really simple. It's really easy to put up a fake login screen. I can build a application that looks like the login screen where you're already logged in and capture your credentials. By making you do a series of keystrokes, I'm now enforcing that you're getting to the right login screen and forcing away any potential false login screens or cluing you in that, hey, why am I at this login screen? I didn't hit the magic 3-finger salute before getting here.
Yeah, and I think that does give an opportunity. And the biggest thing I hear everyone really wanting to start or already doing is the security awareness training. And I think what you just said right there is if they get accustomed to something like needing to click Control Delete, it makes them more aware to say, hey, I didn't have to do my usual security. Is this something I should report? So that was a really good example. Awesome. Let's go into that next slide. So don't display last sign in. So this is one that I also come across during all of my onboardings. Some of the smaller micro businesses that managed service providers do support, I have found they may not always know their username. So it's something to where that managed service provider will reach out and say, hey, you cleared out the last username. They created tickets. This is Senteon's fault. It's like, no, we did do the GPO to where we wanted to get that set to, and it does just take kind of the awareness of what's coming and talking about it. So don't display last sign in is set to enabled. Josh, talk to us a little bit more about this.
Yeah, this is one that people always complain about
Mm-hmm.
because they're used to just being able to put in their password. I've logged in, I locked the computer, walked away to the printer, came back, unlocked the computer. Why can't I just put my password in? And it's making me put my username and password back in to unlock this. And I understand the pain, I understand the frustration, but also look at it from the perspective of someone like me who has done pen testing. Because you're logged in, you walked away. If I walk by, hit that 3-finger salute, now I know what your logins look like. I can use that information to then start building out a list of usernames, whether I'm using some open source data, like going to your website and looking at your company directory and seeing all these names and going, oh, everyone at Senteon is first initial dot last name at Senteon.
Yep.
Well, look, here's a list of everyone that works at Senteon in their various roles. So now I know that their standard pattern is first initial dot last name at Senteon. that gives me one more thing I can look at. And then I can go even a step further and go on dark web and look for, Zach Kromkowski, who has been breached at other places and what password he used there. And then start building kind of a file and go, well, I know what his username should be because this is the format that they use. He's been breached and he's used the same password 4 other places. There's a statistical probability that it's that password or some variation of that password. And now I'm in, all because you didn't want to type your username in every time you went to go log back in.
Shame on you, Zach. Shame on you.
Cancun 2016. That's not the right password to use over and over. No,
Yeah, probably not.
I hear you on that. And
What's further defense on that? So let's say you have the username, you've got 50% of the login right there. Now you just need to come up with the credentials. If you're looking for Zach's, obviously you're going to scrape those super easy. Hopefully not as easy as everyone else's. But if we go to the next slide, this is where you can help protect against that brute force attack that understands the username and is trying to stuff credentials in there until they find the right one. How important is this, Josh?
Yeah, this is absolutely critical. And I love that it's highlighted, but not 0, because 0 means that there is no threshold.
The world is yours.
Just keep banging in those passwords till one works.
Until it eventually works. So, and this comes back to one of those things of what's your pain threshold? Is your threshold 3? Is it 5? Is it 10? What's best for your business? What type of data are you protecting? It might be one of those things where it's not the same for everybody. The person who's out on the floor that's doing really basic work might be at the 10, but your, C-suite folks or your finance folks, you might set that to 3 because you want to reduce the amount of time they have if there are reused credentials that have been pushed out on the black web, that they've kind of done all that open source stuff. This also allows you to kind of create flags in your SIM tools
There you
that
go.
say, hey, look, there's a potential brute force attack going on. And then I can go look in the logs and go, it's not just against Zach, it's also against, Rich, it's also against Josh, and correlate that and go, all right, now I have a coordinated attack. Maybe now's the time I do a forced password rechange on everyone in the organization. Maybe it's time for me to start looking at implementing 2FA, MFA, maybe do smart card login as a option, something along those lines.
Double
based
check
off
your
of the
network
real metrics I'm
segmentation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're going into an awesome topic, and I might have asked you questions along this line last week, but talk to us. You mentioned create flags in your SIM tools and being able to correlate. Could these configurations really be a true indicator of compromise and a piece of that forensic puzzle? How valuable is it to know when these configurations are changed or hit? What does that mean?
Well, yeah, it's absolutely imperative to kind of have this information from a security standpoint, because when these things are changed, somebody changed it. Systems don't magically change themselves. I would love to believe that the number of times I've had something go completely sideways, but 100% of the time, a human has caused that change to occur. Whether it's you forced something, it was an unintended consequence, or you did it on purpose, changes happen because somebody told it to do that. And understanding that when there are changes to your environment, particularly if they're unauthorized changes, really becomes that indicator of compromise that, maybe I need to look at this a little bit harder. Why did all of a sudden 5 of my machines now have, their interactive logout threshold set to 0? I'm like, excuse me, what? Why is that occurring?
So what about if we have that set properly, where we feel like we're good to go on that setting, and I'm logged on my machine like I am right now, and I have to go to the bathroom also like I have to right now, and I walk away from my machine. What's the risk there if I rush to the bathroom and my screen's open? Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, so this slide right here, machine inactivity timeout, with that segue into it. So CIS does recommend 900 or fewer seconds, which is 15 minutes or less. So should be plenty of time for you to be able to go there and back. But
Too
Josh,
much
going
time,
along that
probably, right?
probably.
Arguably too much time. Gosh, tell us why.
I'm like, this is another one of those kind of super critical ones that seem dumb from a user perspective. I'm just going to get up, walk to the printer, get something, and come back. But what could somebody do if they sat down at your computer? If you get someone like me who
Everything.
might wind up with a message saying, you are absolutely in love with somebody, you want to run off to the Bahamas and be their cabana boy. And that's at the very, annoying but minute end of the spectrum. But
That was
the other side,
actual real life example from Zach, by the way. Just keep that down low.
I also changed the background. It was beautiful.
yeah, or you put in like a rubber ducky and it flips everything around and reverses all the controls. You know, general mischief that's fun, but gets the point that, hey, dummy, don't walk away from your computer and leave it unlocked. But there's the real issue of now somebody who is not authorized, who is not you, for all intents and purposes to the network is you, with all of your access, all the rights, and a fully unlocked system with
Right
physical
on.
access to that
You own
device.
it.
I'm like, you just handed them the keys and you handed them your keys. So everything will point back to you. So, 15 minutes might be a bit long in my opinion. I'm more of a 5-minute guy for
Mhm.
automatic lockout. But then I also come from a DoD background where the rule was if you walked away, it had to be locked. And if you were doing something like a command readiness inspection, if you walked away from your computer and it was unlocked, that was an automatic Cat 1 finding for your entire installation. One person doing it. And that's
It's
huge.
not that quite severe in my part of CIS, but that is mandatory and enforced. That if
Wow.
you are you don't walk away from your machine ever if it's unlocked.
Yeah, and Josh, let's dive a little bit more into that. Obviously, in that situation with the DoD, there's direct repercussions and notes on that. But going to the general world, PCI compliance, HIPAA, and just kind of auditing compliance in general. Do these settings that we've talked about today really align to those? I mean, machine inactivity timeout specifically, I know does map across the board to these.
Yeah.
I mean, do auditors look at these configurations? Are they important to them and the change history? Is there anything that auditors would care about here?
Yeah. Auditors absolutely care about this. When you come in, the first thing they're going to see is they're wanting to see a RSOP, resultant a policy from your GPO on a box that is processing, that's in scope for either your
Mm-hmm.
SOC 2 or your, ISO 27001 or your RMF, your NIST 23 or NIST 853, whatever your compliance is, they're going to want to see that and validate that against what their benchmarks are, what the desired state is.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not what it should be, and you don't have a valid reason based off of a accepted security risk that's been properly vetted and documented, that's going to be a finding. And particularly if you look at things like HIPAA data, do you really want it to be where you go into your family doctor and the screen doesn't lock out and there's all your medical information, everything about you for the last 10 years, and then the next person comes into that room and it's still up and all your data is still there.
I've personally seen that.
Me,
I've
me
seen it
too.
numerous
Mhm.
times.
I mean, they leave me alone in the room. They step out, computer's sitting there. It's not like the doctor is constantly thinking about the security, but that's
They should.
the awareness we need to really shift.
Yeah, and you're
That's
leaving.
that's a big HIPAA violation right there.
Mhm.
Just it probably happens every day.
And if the wrong regulator finds that, you can lose your ability to process HIPAA data, which for a medical practice means you stop doing work.
Big impact.
Cybersecurity is absolutely becoming a cost of even just performing their business operations. So it's awesome to see that trend becoming more aware and that we can have conversations like that about this today. But let's move on to interactive logon with the message text for users attempting to log on. So talk to us a little bit about this. And I will note CIS does not provide a direct recommendation for here. So you can kind of customize this message to be either as scary as you want or as kind as you want. But Josh, talk to us about this.
This is one that I absolutely recommend everyone enable across the board. Talk to your legal department and get a verbiage that best suits what you're doing. This is on typical systems. You will see this is your consent to monitoring as a click through banner that they have to, click that banner, acknowledge that they are being monitored. What data is being collected? How is it being stored? What regulations are being covered under the system, whether it's a, ISO 27001 or a, you know, NIST framework document, or your DoD organization, there's a law or some kind of regulatory requirement to protect this data. That is your spot to reinforce that every time someone logs in. You should have that in your acceptable use policy that you make every user sign as part of their onboarding and then periodically through routine training. But this is one of those things that it has stood up in court. It is one of those things that you have affirmatively clicked this every time and acknowledged that this is a requirement of this system.
Like it. How about Josh? What about caching credentials? What's the risk there?
Really, cache credentials are kind of one of those situations where, what's your use case? Is it something that, is this a Windows machine that sits in the office 24/7, never goes anywhere? Like, if that's the case, you're always on your domain. Why would you ever cache credentials? Or why would you ever cache more than one set of credentials for that box? And ultimately, it's because you're not going to need to keep those credentials on that box. Now, conversely, if you have a laptop that's going all over with somebody,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm probably going to want to cache credentials because I might not be able to, depending on how you have your configuration set up for your VPN or your SD-WAN capabilities, the ability to get to the domain controller before login. So in cases like that, yeah, I want to set cache credentials, but I want to make sure that I'm being very, very selective on which ones I'm doing, because I don't want everyone to have the same thing. I want my desktops to all have, you know, either 0 or 1. I might want all my laptops to only allow 1 or 2 cache credentials. That way you're reducing the risk, because those cache credentials stay the same
Yep.
until the next time they log into the domain.
So
So if
it's important to know the use case. And Josh, what would you say? Do you find that organizations are not following the principles you're outlining and are just using a blanket policy, if you will, exposing their creating a larger risk attack surface as a result?
Yeah, that's absolutely kind of what I've seen across the board. Unless you're one of those highly regulated organizations that
That have been
have
called
a
out in an audit.
very clearly, auditable, and have a clear tie back to things like CIS benchmarks. A lot of the stuff, they just don't understand what it's there or why it's for, and leave it at whatever the default setting
Right.
is, because it works. It's kind of like when
Not
you get the
broken.
Cisco switch. You take the shrink wrap off, you put it in the rack, and you put cables into it, and it just works. But it's still in its completely default configuration. Passwords admin or Cisco, and you're not getting any real value out of it.
Well,
You
people,
know,
people have good intentions. Unfortunately, the settings can be confusing, and if you don't understand what the setting is and how it improves your posture, you'll ignore it because, like, oh, it's working. It's that's how they set it up, good to go. But if you do need to think about them and dive down and make sure you understand what that setting's really saying, and what kind of risk you're engaging in or accepting by either having that setting on or off, or depending on whatever the setting is.
Yeah, and one of the kind of the cases for this is, let's say I have a computer that has multiple cache credentials on it, and we know that that machine's compromised, and we make all those user change passwords. That means nothing on that box until it comes back and touches the domain. Somebody could still use those scraped cache credentials they found from the dark web and still access that machine and all material on that machine, which potentially has negative effects on your business enterprise because it's got your PII on, it's got your intellectual property, it's got your financials. That can be huge for a setting that you really don't realize is that important or even what it does.
Right on.
No. Very good. This next setting is a little bit more straightforward, but prompt user to change password before expiration. So I don't think this needs too much of an explanation, but I do want to call out this did you know fact. What does it mean if your password does expire? How can that impact business disruption? And I guess, again, why is this setting important, Josh?
Yeah, when your password expires, particularly in a Windows environment, the first thing it makes you do when you log in with that expired password is change the password. Well, if I'm not using that credential to log into a Windows system first, I do not have the ability to get to that screen to do that, and it will not let you fully log in. So if you're using, your Windows AD as your single sign-on for multiple applications, you've now effectively locked yourself out of something like your ServiceNow or your Salesforce because the user doesn't know that their password is expired and they're banging their head against the wall going, why isn't this working? And because they're a SaaS solution, they haven't logged into their Windows machine to get the prompt to change their password. So by setting this warning, 5 to 14 days prior, you give kind of that ample, 1 to 2 week window to say,
Mm-hmm.
hey, pay attention. You probably need to do this sooner than later because you could lose access if you don't.
And that's one thing I always try to emphasize every single week. The CIS benchmarks, although extremely mitigate your cybersecurity risk, reducing the attack surface, they also help you keep business operations going, right? They provide you their strong baseline to make sure you can only access what you need, and set up everything properly so you can keep business functions going. And this setting is a prime example of that. So, oh, Rich, you're on mute.
There we go. We're back. So how can we expand upon that, and really focus on workstations and making sure that they have proper settings on our next slide to really kind of further reduce that attack surface and make sure that that workstation is who it says it is and is not going to in itself introduce risk into the environment by connecting. What do you think, Josh? Tell us about that.
So this one's kind of one of those unique ones that it only applies or should typically only apply to actual domain servers because of the data that's typically on those servers. Your workstation, you might want them to be able to log in without domain controller authentication for reasons that are just as simple as the internet's out in that location and you still want them to be able to authenticate. And that's using that one cache credential that you set in force from your policy. But on your domain controllers, these are the brains of your network. These are the things that allow you to kind of get all of your other things going. And then taking that out to all of your servers that are in that environment. These are kind of your crown jewels. You definitely don't want them to be able to authenticate without going into, the domain controller and validating this is in fact a current credential for a current user. It's not been cached. It's not someone who has been, fired and they yoinked a piece of hardware and walked out and are now trying to get back in.
Excellent.
And we got We got a couple questions we're going to get to after this last configuration. And Josh, this last one is smart card removal behavior is set to lock workstation. So smart cards, first of all, a lot of the audience may need you to explain what this is. From what I've seen in the clients I work with, it's not very popular anymore, at least in the the segments that I work in. So explain to us, what is smart card, and then why is this set to lock workstation?
Yeah, sure. If you work anything federal government, you'll be very, very familiar with the smart card. DoD calls them a CAC, a Common Access Card. Um, the rest of FedGov calls them a PIV. Uh, I forget what PIV
Oh,
actually stands for.
stumped him. He finally forgot an acronym.
But it's essentially it's a ID card that has a chip on, just like most of your credit cards do now, and functions in much the same way. Instead of using a username password, it is a two-factor authentication where you put the card into a card reader, and then you put the appropriate PIN that's associated with that card, and that does your authentication. Essentially, what this is doing is when you pull your card, it locks the workstation just like you would do a
Yep.
Control Alt Delete if you're using a username password. If you've worked uh, personal identity verification, thank you, Chad, for putting that out there. Um, but essentially, it works as your credentials. Um, it's much safer than using a username password because you have to have two factors authentication. It's something you have and something you know. And then on top of that, you have to have a system that's configured to work with that. So you have to have a computer that has a card reader. So you're adding kind of extra layers of security. Um, a kind of one of those things when you look at this from the DoD environment, your ID card is kind of your key to everything. Gets you on the base, it gets you, into your computer. Many of the buildings have RFID readers that are built into your ID card. It's allowing you to do multiple security controls with one single device. In this case, an ID card or a CAC or a PIV. Really, it's a great
Mhm.
tool, particularly if you're doing, additional things like PKI infrastructure on your environment to do digital signing, digital encryption from individual levels, because it allows you to make that a two-factor
Yep.
authentication type of encryption. So great technology, still largely focused in the FedGov, DoD environment, some state government, and it's largely because it's expensive. It's not cheap, and when someone doesn't have their CAC or their PIV, they can't get
Yeah,
into the
that's
system.
it. Hmm. Yeah, that was going to be my question. Why this isn't more widely adopted in smaller businesses? Because your explanation, I mean, that sounded like it mitigates a lot of risk from my point of view. So it really is just a barrier on price and usability.
Yep, that standard usable on this hand, security on this hand.
Yeah.
Where's your acceptable level in between?
All right. Well, that is the settings for today. So we're going to switch over to some Q&A, and I want to have one of Chad's questions pop up. The second comment that he made, Cliff. The current best practices with relation to password. Actually, it's going to be a little too long probably for him to share on the screen. Oh, we got it all. So Josh, could you kind of talk towards this question? And I will note with LDAP and everything, we are going to be getting into that in future episodes. But Josh, could you talk towards this question?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as with a lot of my answers, what is your use case? What is your technological limitations? Are you using a legacy system that requires you to use only a password that is 14 characters long because that's the maximum number of characters that it allows? So you have to take that as your first factor of, what is my technical limitations? For a lot of years, it was super long passwords that were, uppercase, lowercase, mixed characters, change passwords every, 90 days. And that was based off of the NIST recommendation for passwords. NIST did update their guidance and now recommends a super long passphrase that you don't have to change as often because you're using a passphrase, not a password. The more letters and characters you use, even if you're using less funky characters, becomes harder to crack because you're essentially making each iteration of that length significantly harder. Um, One of the things that I've suggested is think of phrases that are fairly easy to remember, like "we're off to see the wizard." You know, it's super easy. You know what it is. You can type it really easy. You can throw some uppercase, lowercase, whatever you want in there, and that provides you a really long and strong password using something that's easy to remember. Because the problem that we've had with the older passwords is they required no dictionary words, no substitutions, and you got passwords that nobody remembered. And essentially, what would occur is they would write them down, or you'd go onto their computer and you'd see a text file or a Word document, typically titled "passwords," with a list of username and passwords. Now with a plethora of password utilities out there, they all have computer generated passwords that you're able to use, extremely strong passwords, and you have to remember one master password to get those. But that becomes a case of make sure that you're using a password utility that is secure, that's using the right level of encryption, that hasn't been breached 3 times in the last year. And you're using a password that's appropriate to the level of material that you're using.
We got a follow up on that one from chat again. We'll let you take this one too, Josh. So would you lessen expiry requirements if you're able to build in or leverage from an IDP a second factor?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things in DoD, they don't require you to change the PIN of your CAC. I had the same PIN number my entire career, but my CAC expired every 4 years. I had to get a new one. And because it was multi-factor, you had to know the PIN, you had to have the physical card, you had to have access to a building that had access to computers that were set up for that. It created these additional levels of security that allowed you to make things easier for the user, but still increase security. So if I'm using super strong identity platform that has appropriate multi-factor authentication, maybe I'm not as stringent on the password requirements because I'm leveraging additional mitigating controls.
And Josh, I think we talked about it a bit the last time you were with us. When you have that legacy system that isn't able to comply to modern password standards and recommendations, and everyone has that system, maybe more than one, it's important to take extra security precautions and really isolate that system on your network, segment it, and take those extra layers of defense and depth to protect those systems that might not be complying to the standards we wish because of technical limitation.
Absolutely.
And we got one more follow up on that, and this could probably be a topic of its own, but I guess in your 60-second point of view, Josh, where do you see the industry going with passwordless passkeys?
Really comes down to as we start getting closer and closer to quantum computing, everything's going to change. You're going to just have to evolve with each iteration of the cycle that we come out with new technology. So I definitely expect, as we march towards the goal of zero trust, that we're going to be adding more and more levels of complexity to enable that security. So I think eventually passwords will go away on modern systems, but I don't think they'll ever go completely away because we're still using, Unix systems from the 1970s in some baking industry. You know, you've got to kind of look at what your overarching is. So yeah, I think passwordless is on the horizon sooner rather than later. Passphrases, pass keys, definitely working towards that. But one of the biggest issues is always going to be cost. Once we get it to the point where it's cost effective to use, then it will become more prevalent.
I love the answer. And we're going to be right up at the hour with that one. So Josh, thank you again for being a reoccurring guest, our first one. I know we're going to have many recurring guests that people have really enjoyed the show and being part of it. So thank you for being the first one. We are here every week. We aim to have this webinar every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Sometimes there are some scheduling conflicts, so we adjust that every now and then. But next week will be 1 p.m. on Microsoft Network Client and Microsoft Network Server. So we are going to be combining two sections again with Marty Godsey. Then we're going into network access with Dan Lee and network security with Dominic Vogel. So 3 hot topics coming up in the next few weeks. We also provide recaps in our newsletter. The link is in the chat, so please subscribe. We do provide exclusive slides of really just deep dives to help you fully understand each benchmark individually. And the last one, definitely connect with us. Senteon does provide, go to the next slide. Senteon does provide the application available for you to run gap assessments for free against the CIS benchmarks. And Rich and I are always here to connect and answer questions afterwards. So with that, I will let you apart. Thank you again, Josh, for stepping up and being here again. And thank you, Rich, for being my co-host, man.
I got you. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks as always.
Appreciate it. Nice job.